I'm a 22-year millennial, and this encounter happened a few months ago. I live in an apartment just outside of my college campus. It's a fairly nice, newer apartment building, but the surrounding area is pretty shady. I don't spend any time around there though. I just drive down to my campus and back. I hadn't had any bad experiences before this, so I didn't ever find myself worried about much of anything. It was a Friday, and I'd just gotten back from school. I stayed late to get some extra studying done, so it was around 7 o'clock. I pulled into the small parking lot and headed inside the building. Walking inside, I went up the stairs to my room on the 4th floor, and went inside, dropping my school bag right by the shoe rack I kept next to the door. I grabbed a pre-made salad from the fridge and sat on the couch to watch something while I ate. While scrolling through YouTube on the TV, a very loud, sudden thump came from the room below. It wasn't an alarming sound, necessarily, but more just surprising and out of nowhere. I listened for a moment, then continued with searching for a video to watch. A few minutes later, that same sound came from below me again. I paused the video and sat there, patiently waiting for it to happen again. I was more curious than anything. After a couple minutes, it happened again, but this time it was louder, and it even caused the walls to vibrate and shake. It was more obviously someone banging something against the wall, but I didn't know what or why. I waited again, but after a bit of no further sounds, I just continued about my night. I'm not sure how much time passed, but it wasn't too long, maybe 40 or 50 minutes, when I heard a knock by the front door. I was in the kitchen, which was right next to the door, so I knew the knock didn't come from my door, but most likely my neighbor's. Listening more carefully, I could hear a man mumbling something. It sounded like he was having a whole conversation with himself, just whispering and mumbling random sentences. I won't lie, it kinda creeped me out. When the mumbling stopped, I went over to the door and looked out the peephole to see if he was gone. The dude was standing in the dark, right in front of my door. He was looking down at the knob as if contemplating whether or not to try opening it. I backed up, trying to quietly walk back to the couch to grab my phone just in case, but almost immediately the guy banged on my door. He began mumbling again too, making me believe he was definitely on some hard drugs or something. I took my phone and held it tightly, unsure of what exactly my next move was going to be. I didn't know if he was just some harmless druggie or if he had worse intentions, but I felt fairly safe where I was, so I held off on doing anything. After maybe 30 seconds though, the man banged on my door again, yelling something at me, though it was heavily slurred and unrecognizable. I ran to my bedroom and called the police. I didn't know what he wanted, but the fact that he wasn't leaving made me pretty scared of what he wanted. The operator said they were a few minutes out and asked if I wanted to stay on the line. I told him I was okay and hung up. Just then, the guy outside the door started banging even harder. He was definitely hitting the door with something, as it was too powerful of hits for it just to be his hands. It sounded more like he was trying to break the door down at this point. I grabbed a baseball bat from the corner of my room and prepared to hold my ground as the man continued with his efforts. This went on a while, until I saw the reflection of flashing blue lights outside the window. A minute later, an officer called out something in the stairway, making the man by the door stop. I heard them take the guy down, and I opened the front door to talk to the police. There were huge dents and cracks on the front, clearly having been smashed with some sort of hammer or even a crowbar. But what I found out next was extremely tragic and awful. The room below mine had a young lady living in it, who was found unconscious due to heavy blows to the head. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to recover and passed away at the hospital. Her front door was wide open with no signs of damage, so it's likely she answered the door unknowing of who was there. After beating the lady, he smashed several holes in the walls of her apartment, using a large hammer that they found him holding while arresting him. The guy was heavily under the influence of drugs and alcohol, and apparently told the officers that he was looking for a stash hidden in the walls. There were no signs of anything being hidden in any of the rooms after being searched, so the guy likely just made it up in his head while drugged up. What's terrifying is that he was really close to doing the same thing to me as he did to the lady below me. I feel really bad for her though, probably just being nice and opening the door. No idea that her fate was behind it. I was driving home from my friend's house. It was late. I don't know exactly the time, but if I had to guess, it was probably 2 or 3 a.m. I lived 20 minutes away, which wasn't too far, since most houses around here are spread out. The rain and lack of streetlights made it hard to see though, so I was driving slower and more carefully. 5 minutes down the road, I pulled up to a traffic light. I had the red light, but there was a blue car on the other side, who was on the road, partially in the intersection. Its headlights and everything were on, but it was just sitting there at a green light. I couldn't tell if there was something wrong, or maybe they were asleep, but when the lights changed, I drove forward, slowly maneuvering around them. I tried to discreetly look in their car as I passed, but the rain on my window blocked most of my view. Only a moment after passing them, and driving down the road again, the blue car turned and started following me down the road, so it wasn't broken down after all. I kept my eye on the mirrors. I wouldn't consider myself a paranoid person, but the situation felt staged. Another minute down the road, the car's headlights started getting brighter in my mirrors as they pulled their car closer to what felt like just a couple of feet from my back bumper. In weather like this, that made me really uncomfortable. I looked back at the road, but saw a small light pop up on my dashboard. It was a signal that one of my tires was low on air. A common signal, but it felt like an odd time for it just to pop up, given the situation. I looked back in my mirrors, seeing the car still tailing me. They were so close, their headlights almost made it hard to even see the actual car. I was just 4 or 5 minutes away from home, nearing the entrance to the neighborhood, when my dashboard started flickering a new signal: flat tire. My stomach dropped. The second I saw that signal, I put all the pieces together and was almost 100% sure that this car behind me had done something. I drove another minute, hoping to make it closer to home, but I could feel my car sinking to the left and I was practically driving on the rims now. I had to pull over. The car behind me did the same. I should have called someone as soon as I parked, but I was so concerned and focused with what the person behind me was doing that it didn't even cross my mind. Though, even if I did call someone, it probably wouldn't have prevented what happened next. Once parked, 3 doors opened from the car and 3 men came out. I only had a few seconds to prepare and react, but I was helpless and defenseless. They ran up to my car, 2 on my side and 1 on the other. One of the men came right up to my window, yelling at me to open the door and pointing a gun at me. It happened so fast, I was just in some dazed state. I started to reach for the door, but the man by the back door smashed something against the window, shattering it, then reached his hand in and opened the back door. They were all still yelling, both at me and at each other. The man in the back reached across, opening the other back door, then reached in front of me to open my door. I was still just sitting there, holding my hands up now to show I wasn't a threat. I knew there was no way out of this, even if I did have a weapon. Once my door was open, the man with the gun pulled me out of the car and slammed me on the ground. The oddest thing is, while I was on the ground, looking out into the rainy pavement, all I was thinking about was how cold and wet the pavement was, not about how I had a gun being pushed into the back of my head, or that I was being robbed and beaten. I think it was my head trying to distance myself from the traumatizing situation I was in. I wasn't on the ground for long before the men by the car called out and the guy holding me down hit me in the back of the head, causing me to ricochet off the pavement. I wasn't even sure if he hit me with a gun or just his fist, because I was already numb. I'm surprised it didn't knock me out though. I heard their car doors close and then driving away. I rolled over, still in a daze, and tried to pick myself up. They'd taken my phone, so I was forced to drive my car home and call the police when I got there, which ended up denting and damaging my rims anyway. The investigation went nowhere, determining only that the suspects had purposefully placed small tire spikes in the road at the intersection I crossed them at. I got lucky to have only hit one spike in 4 to have caused less damage than usual. They likely planned to ambush me as soon as I hit the trap, but in the end, it didn't make a difference. I used to go camping all the time with some of my buddies from college, but once we graduated, we could never find time anymore. Everyone's schedules were different, so I ended up going out on my own. There was a camping ground that we used to go to a lot, so I played it safe and went to that same place. It was somewhat far out and not the easiest to get to, but that's why I liked it. Nobody would ever be there because there were a lot of easier options nearby to camp at. Knowing the route, I got there no problem and set all my stuff up. Not long after though, a man showed up. He looked like any other hiker, but he only had a small backpack, so definitely no tent or camping gear. The only thing that had me questioning why he was here was that this wasn't a very scenic spot or anything. It was a nice place to camp because it was an open area with trees around, but if you're not camping, then there would be no reason to hike all the way out here. I didn't think all that much about it at the time because the man seemed normal enough. Maybe he just wanted a quiet space to relax for a bit. I stayed by my tent and the man stayed on the other side of the campground. Around 6, I walked away from my tent to cook my food, and it was around this time that I saw the man finally leave. I thought it was a little late to be walking back because it was going to be completely dark in less than an hour, and the hike was probably 3 hours. Other than that, I was just happy to be alone now. I boiled some water with my mini stove and made one of my freeze-dried meals, then went back near my tent and sat down. The sun was just about gone, so I brought out a small lantern and hung it on the side of the tent as I stayed outside and took in the atmosphere. It suddenly hit me that I was alone out there, and that usually this is when we'd all gather around and talk by a campfire. But by myself, I didn't really have anything to do. After a while, I turned off the lantern and went inside my tent, laying down and turning in for the night. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps nearby. When I opened my eyes, it was pitch black, and I had no idea how long I'd been asleep for. But the footsteps came closer and closer until they stopped on the other end of the campground. After a few seconds, I felt around for my lantern and turned it on, then unzipped the tent and looked out. Turned 20 or so feet from my tent, there was the shape of a man standing right by where I'd seen the guy from earlier standing, and from what I can make out, it was likely the same person, but they were just standing there, not doing anything. It was far enough into the night that this was immediately disturbing, no matter the context, and having turned my lantern on, he definitely saw me. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out to him. I waited a couple seconds, but he didn't show any signs of acknowledging me. I couldn't even tell which direction he was facing, but he was either facing away from me or directly at me, and I don't even know which way was more disturbing. I reached for my pocket knife from my backpack, then did the only thing I could do, which was stay sitting there and wait. The most increasingly uneasy 15 minutes of my life passed as I looked at this man standing there and barely move, before he suddenly turned and walked off in the same direction he had gone before, and I could see from the way his figure moved when he turned that he had been facing me. So that whole time he was there, he was just staring at me. I felt chills run through me as the man's footsteps got quieter and quieter, fading out in the distance. I didn't know what else to do other than stay up in case he came back, and as far as I know, he never did. I left in the morning and got back safely, but since then, I haven't been out camping. I don't know what that man was doing, but there's no world in which that wasn't extremely disturbing. Maybe I scared him off by waking up and watching him to make sure he didn't do anything, but that just terrifies me to think about if I hadn't woken up that night. When I was 20 years old, I lived in a very small, one-bedroom apartment that I'd moved into when I turned 18. Having a better job and more money in the bank, I decided to rent a small house and leave the apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had more space and was a nice step up from where I used to live. The only thing I didn't account for was that everything looked off. Coming from the apartment, my furniture was way too small and didn't match the interior of the home. It just looked like I moved into a house larger than I could afford. So over the next couple months, I saved up more money and put it aside to buy new furniture. And during these months, I also listed a whole bunch of stuff on Craigslist to start getting rid of. Aside from the couch and a couple other things, I listed most of the dressers, storage shelves, and other large furnishings for free. I didn't care about getting paid, so long as they were able to help me haul it out of my house. I sold and gave away most of the items until only 2 things were left: my old bedroom dresser and a nightstand, which nobody seemed to want. After a month though, someone finally contacted me about them. They asked if both of them were still available and if they were actually free. I said yes to both, and we agreed on a date for pickup. On that day, I didn't get home from work until an hour before the time they were supposed to come. But when I pulled up to my house, there was a truck in the driveway. I went up beside them and looked in the window, but nobody was in sight. I opened the garage and parked, then went back outside to further inspect the random truck in my driveway. When I looked this time though, someone was in the car. They waved and got out, introducing themselves as the person from Craigslist here to pick up the furniture. I took a second to react because I was trying to figure out where they were when I pulled in. "You're an hour early." He said he was sorry, but something came up, so he needed to come early. I still didn't understand why he didn't text me before coming unannounced, but since he was here, I showed him inside. He looked at the items for a second and said he'd take them. I helped him haul out the large dresser and put it in his truck bed. We went back in for the nightstand, but as he picked it up, a shuffling sound came from downstairs, followed by a quiet thump. I looked down the staircase, then back at the man, who was now looking at me in a very unsettling way. "Everything okay?" he said in a very monotone voice. I hesitantly nodded and walked downstairs, showing him out. I closed the door behind him and watched out the window to make sure he left. That whole interaction was very odd from beginning to end, but what I found after was horrifying. Later that night, I saw a small streak on the wall just outside one of the downstairs closets, like someone had brushed against it. I looked around some more, finding very faint shoe prints inside the closet. Someone had clearly been hiding in there. I put 2 and 2 together, and I was pretty sure there was another person in my house along with the man. They broke in before I got home from work, and when they heard me pulling into the driveway, one of them hid in the closet while the other went back to the car. The shuffling sound I heard toward the end was likely the other person leaving the closet. I had the police do what they could, but the 2 men seemed to cover up their tracks. I gave them descriptions of the one man I saw and the truck he was driving, but that was that. It was a terrible experience, and after that, I only used Craigslist when I could avoid meeting at my house. Otherwise, I would just donate things or buy stuff off eBay. It feels like nowadays anyone can do anything and get away with it so easily as long as they plan ahead. I was 16 at the time. My parents were away on a short vacation to celebrate their 20th anniversary. I acted sad when they left, but really I was super excited to be alone and have the whole house to myself. They left Friday morning after I went to school. When I got home, I made a quick snack with the food they left me, then went to the living room to play video games for the entire night. I had no school tomorrow and nobody was home to tell me to go to bed, so I wanted to stay up as late as possible and enjoy the time I had. I was playing online with my friends for a while, but my buddies weren't as lucky as me, so at around 10 p.m., all of my friends had to hop offline. Come 11, or maybe closer to 12 even, my neighbor's dog started barking. They had a huge dog, so it was really loud, even though their house was a good distance away from mine. I kept playing, but through the headphones, I could still hear the dog barking like crazy for what had been a whole 3 or 4 minutes. It was really late, so I was both concerned and annoyed. When I found a good time to pause my game, I got up really fast and looked out the side window over at their house. None of their lights were on, but their dog was still barking. I was pretty sure it was barking from inside the house too. Then I saw a man walking through their yard and onto the sidewalk. It was dark and hard to see, and I didn't see where he came from. Knowing the dog was probably barking at the guy by their house and seeing him walking away, I went back to playing my game. I played for 15 minutes or so before someone knocked on my door. It made me jump, but I was in the middle of a match, so I couldn't just get up. I kept playing during the knocks continue. When the match ended, I took my headphones off and heard the knocks again. With my headphones off though, I realized it was coming from the back door, not the front door. Then I remembered how late it was and got really confused, but also a bit agitated. What could they possibly want from me this bad to be continually knocking on the door at midnight? I stood up, but then I decided I didn't want them to see me and thought that if they realized nobody was home, then they'd leave and come back some other time. And if they stayed, then I'd know something was wrong. All the blinds were closed, so I didn't have to worry about that. I sat back down and continued playing. No more knocks came for a while after that. I played until almost 2 a.m. I was really tired, and my eyes were struggling from staring at the TV for so long. I took my headphones off and turned off the TV, then went upstairs to get in bed. Lay in bed for a few minutes maybe, not very long, when I heard something outside. A vehicle coming up our gravel driveway and stopping right in front of the garage. I stayed in bed, listening carefully. Someone got out of the car and closed their door, then walked around the house. I lost track of the footsteps once they made their way toward the backyard. A shiver ran through me. I got up and walked down the stairs slowly, still trying to not let anyone know I was home. But about halfway down the stairs, I heard someone by the back door. It sounded like they were messing with the lock. I ran back upstairs and called the police. I tried not to sound panicked, probably because I was a stupid 16-year-old and wanted to be cool. But they dispatched some officers to my house and told me to wait for 10 minutes until they arrived. I said okay and hung up the phone, then locked my bedroom door and waited. A minute later, there were a few noises coming from the back door. Then it opened. I heard someone walk in, then go into the living room. It sounded like they were taking things and putting them in a box. They moved quickly through each room downstairs, but after they went through the kitchen, they left, going back outside. I heard their car door open and close. I was relieved for just an instant, before I heard footsteps reapproaching the house, coming back inside and into the last room downstairs. I guess they dropped the box off and came back for more. At this point, I was regretting not showing myself, because the person downstairs really seemed to think nobody was home. He was making a lot of noise and was confident enough to come in for seconds. I was still sitting in my room, just listening to this horrible event taking place below me, when the footsteps started coming up the stairs. They went straight for my parents' bedroom, which was right next to mine. They were in there for a while, then they came out and went up to my door. The handle shook. Then the footsteps immediately left, back down the stairs and out of the house. The car pulled out and was gone in seconds. My heart was beating rapidly, and I was trying to control my breathing. I thought I was seconds away from having to fight for my life. When the police finally arrived, I told them everything. They called my parents too. After they checked around and finished getting info from me, the officers were confident that person wasn't coming back now that he knew I was inside the home. Aside from all that, my console was stolen, along with a bunch of other expensive things. So not only was I horrified all week, but I was also left with nothing to do until my parents got home. I'm just happy that whoever was behind that door ran away and didn't try to break inside, because if he saw me, I don't know what would have happened. As a kid, I grew up in a normal neighborhood. We had a nice mid-sized home and a very ordinary family. When I turned 7, we adopted a small dog named Max. He was my best friend for years, and as I grew up I'd be home alone more often, but with Max there with me, I'd never really feel like I was alone. I never felt the need to worry or be afraid of anything. Unfortunately, this didn't last forever though. When I turned 15, my family sold our home and moved 20 minutes away to a more isolated, smaller house in a forested area, and sadly, that summer, Max passed away due to old age. I was thankful that it was summer though, because I had time to grieve at home without having to go to school or anything. After a few days of the family grieving together at the loss of our first family dog, things went back to normal. My parents went back to work, and I stayed home on summer break. However, I immediately felt a difference. This was the first time I'd ever really been completely home alone in my entire life. Without Max to always be by my side, I was constantly paranoid and uneasy about every small sound coming from the house. Not to mention, we'd only lived in the place for a few months, so I didn't even really know the area or feel fully safe yet. Anyway, just a week after losing Max, it was another regular day. My parents left for work, and I stayed home. The house was only one story, so the layout was basically just a line. When you walk in the front door, there's the kitchen and living room, which then leads to a long hallway, with 2 rooms on the side and my parents' bedroom at the end. For the past week of being alone, I'd always walk down the hallway and close all of the bedroom doors. For some reason, I didn't like seeing the doors open in the hallway, as it just gave me a weird feeling, so this day was no different. I went along the hallway, closing each door, until I got to my parents' room. I pulled the door through the doorway and began walking back, but immediately realized that I didn't hear the click sound of the door being fully shut, so I turned back around and pulled the door shut more firmly, this time hearing the click sound of the door locking in place. I went back to my room, where I had my computer, and closed the door. I put on my headphones and watched YouTube for almost 2 hours straight, since there wasn't much else to do. By this point though, it was about 9 a.m., and I was ready for some breakfast. I laid my headphones on the desk and opened my room door, stepping into the hallway. As I stepped out and turned towards the living room, I couldn't help but notice something was off in the corner of my eye. I turned my head to look back down the hallway and instantly froze. The door at the end of the hallway was open. I mean, wide open. I must have stood there for a whole minute, just trying not to make any noise and listen for any movement in my parents' bedroom. At this point though, I didn't know what to do. I knew that I had closed that door, and there was no way it could open on its own, so I was pretty confident that somebody could be in the house. I hadn't heard anything though, so I had no idea where they were. They could have been in any room in the house by now. I decided to very quietly and slowly walk through the living room and into the kitchen, frantically swiveling my head all around, fearing that they were hiding somewhere. Upon reaching the kitchen, I grabbed one of my parents' large steak knives, gripping the knife tightly in my right hand. I felt slightly better, but still terrified. I quickly and carefully double-checked the living room and dining room, making sure the intruder wasn't hiding anywhere, then stood at the end of the hallway. I walked down to the spare bedroom, trying to open the door quietly, but it was old and creaky. Everything seemed to be exactly how it was left. Nothing moved at all. I backed out and closed the door. I saved my parents' bedroom for last, as it was the room with the open door, and I was terrified. It didn't help that this house was in the middle of a forest, knowing that no help was anywhere nearby. I stood at the doorway for another minute, only able to see half of my parents' bed, while clutching the knife and listening. It was dead silent. Fear continued to rise inside me as I called out shakily, but there was no response. I tried to sound confident, but I knew it was a thin act. I took a step inside, looking around the corner. It seemed empty, just like the other rooms, with nothing moved at all. I even crouched and looked under the bed, but no one was there. I walked to the other side of the bed, and just as I noticed a small spot of dirt on the floor, I heard a soft thud from behind me. I jumped, heart racing, and stared at the bathroom door that was shut. I could hear frantic movement in there, while also seeing a slight shadow from under the door. A few seconds passed as I stood in fear, before hearing one last thud, followed by footsteps fading away outside the house. still in shock of what had just happened. I carefully walked over and opened the door, immediately noticing the open window. I quickly closed and locked it, then ran to my room to grab my phone. I don't know why I never called the police. I guess I was just young, and I didn't want them to come over if nobody was actually there. But upon reflection, I know I should have just left the house and called the cops to begin with. Anyway, I called my parents first, who then called the police and came home soon after. During their investigation, they found small patches of dirt from someone's shoe pretty much throughout the whole house, except for my room. They were able to tell that it was only one person, however. Strangely, they didn't take anything. Not a single thing was missing from our home. This was obviously really creepy and unusual, making the motives of the intruder much more disturbing. We moved out of the house several months later, though mostly due to other problems with the house. Being in my 20s now, I still think about this encounter every once in a while. I wonder what would have happened if I wasn't wearing my headphones and heard the person enter, since I probably would have looked and seen them. It's terrifying to imagine, but I'm thankful for how everything turned out, aside from the intruder never getting caught. My brother Jason and I moved out to Colorado several years back. We both wanted to live by the mountains, but neither of us could afford to on our own, so we split the rent on a townhome in the suburbs right outside of Denver. This worked out perfectly because we were only 10-15 minutes away from a huge line of mountains. One thing I will mention about these nearby hiking and camping trails, though, is that they're pretty packed. It's so accessible to everyone around and to tourists that almost any time of the year it's hard to find solitude. Because of this, me and my brother decided to plan a 3-day backpacking trip that would take us away from the crowd of people and hopefully give us some peace and quiet. I trusted him to route our trip, and a couple weeks later, we drove down to the trailhead. Only one other car was parked there when we arrived. It was some old-looking SUV covered in dust, looking like it'd been through a rough drive. Seeing as it was likely only one other person was hiking this route, we went in with a positive attitude. The first day of backpacking was an 8-mile hike. Most of the terrain was actually flat until we got to the last couple miles, where we started up a mountain. It was pretty tiring, but Jason promised that the campsite would be worth it, and it turned out he wasn't lying at all. About 3/4 up the mountain, there was a small flat area right on the side of the cliff with a view of the whole valley. It was stunning, especially with the sun starting to set. After taking in the view, we started pitching our tents, then gathered up some sticks and stones to make a fire pit with. Once the fire was going, we sat down and just talked. I don't even have any idea how long we were talking for, at least 2 hours or something, when we both heard something from the trail. We instantly went silent, listening as footsteps started making their way up the trail and toward our campsite. A minute later, a man came out of the dark and into the far light, coming from our fire. He wasn't wearing a headlamp, which every hiker and camper knows is an absolute must when there's even the possibility of being out in the dark. As he walked up, I think both Jason and I knew something was wrong. He had a grin on his face just as he approached the campfire. "Hey, did you need something?" Jason asked, standing up. The man looked at Jason, then at me, keeping his grin as he started to explain himself. He said he was a park ranger and had been following our trail for a while. He said this section had been closed off for the season and we couldn't be here. Something was really off though, because we knew this park was open and we had even gotten permits from the state the day prior to camping out there. We also knew that park rangers would not be out here in the middle of a mountain trail at night, but if he wasn't who he said he was, then what was he doing out here? I could tell Jason's mind was racing too, as we both looked at the man and started asking questions, but he cut us off quickly. "You both need to leave with me right now. Pack up and follow me, I'll lead you guys back to the trailhead." We stood there in silence for a moment, taking in what he just said, and realizing that there was something seriously wrong here. The man still stayed by the fire with that same grin on his face. "No, we're staying here," Jason said. The man looked at him again, then at me, keeping that same eerie grin as he just turned around and walked away. Terrified, we didn't even speak for a few minutes, just listening to make sure he didn't come back. Then we grabbed some more dry sticks and rekindled the fire. Neither of us were sleeping. We stayed up the entire night, sometimes hearing what we thought were footsteps again, but never seeing the man. Once the sun was up, we packed and left, cutting our trip short and retracing the trail back to our car. When we got back, that same dusty SUV was there, which got us both wondering if that hiker had run into the same man as us and what happened to them. We notified the police, but ultimately found nothing out of it. There was no doubt the man was lying about being a park ranger, but the fact that he tried to lead us out into the woods in the middle of the night means he was likely trying something horrible. What that was, we don't know, but it seems like the other hiker may have been unfortunate enough to find out. I had heard warnings before about using Craigslist, people getting scammed, robbed, or even worse, but I was desperate. I needed a new apartment ASAP, and my budget was tight, so I took a chance and started browsing the housing section on Craigslist. I came across a listing for a small apartment in an old building downtown. The rent was cheap and the location was perfect for my job. I emailed the owner and he responded quickly. We discussed a time to meet up, and a couple days later I drove over there. When I arrived at the apartment building, I couldn't help but feel a bit let down. The old brick facade was crumbling and the windows were old and dirty, one of them even boarded up. I climbed the stairs up to the second floor and knocked on the door of apartment 2B. The man opened the door and I was surprised by how friendly he was. He showed me around, which was small but still nice. It was in good condition and I could tell that he put a lot of work into it. He told me he was renovating the whole building and that the construction noise would only be temporary. We talked some more and discussed the price, and I ended up taking the deal. Later in the week, I moved in and set everything up. Every time I saw the outside of the building, I couldn't believe I was living in a place that looked like that, but I just have to remind myself that it was the inside that counted. 3 weeks went by, no problems or concerns about the place, until I started to realize something. Nobody else seemed to live in the building. I never saw anyone parked outside or walking inside, and I never heard anyone through the thin walls. Additionally, I never heard any construction going on, like the owner had said there would be. I kept these thoughts in the back of my mind until one morning when leaving for work, I saw one of the other room's doors was partially open. I walked past it and went about my day, but when I got back later that night, it was still open. After some thought, I figured it had to be vacant. I pushed it more open. Inside, the room was dusty and smelled awful. There were webs and stains all over the walls, and it looked like it had been abandoned for years. I stepped out and closed the door, disgusted that there was a room in the building I lived in that looked like that. I went up to my room, but before I walked in, I became curious about the other rooms. I knocked on my neighbor's door, 2A, and nobody answered. I turned the handle and it was unlocked. When I pushed open the door, the room was the same as the other one, looking to have been abandoned for years. I became really uncomfortable and went back to my room. I contacted the owner, sending him a text asking if any of the other rooms were ready to be rented out. While my room was nice, it felt like I was living alone in an abandoned building, which was really eerie and uncomforting. I waited for the man to respond, but 10 minutes later, I heard the front door to the building open. They walked up to my door and knocked. "Hello, who is it?" I asked before opening the door. They responded, and I recognized their voice as the owner. "I opened the door, I saw your text and thought I'd just come in person," he said, smiling. I nervously smiled back, saying I was just curious about the other rooms. I didn't want to say I went inside them because I probably wasn't supposed to. He maintained his smile. "Why don't I show you one of the rooms I'm finishing up?" I reluctantly followed him across the hall, but then he stopped by apartment 2A, the room I'd just been in. He pushed open the door and walked in, telling me to come inside and have a look. I stayed, thinking of an excuse, but then he told me again and again, now demanding me to come in. I backed away and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I heard him rushing down the stairs and out of the building. After I was sure he left, I started packing up everything, and the next day, I left and never looked back. I never saw that man again, and I never went back to Craigslist for anything. To this day, I still wonder what that building actually was and what the owner was plotting. If I had stepped into that room with him, would I have ever been able to leave? What I'm about to tell you is something I still think about often, especially during this time of year. This happened on New Year's Eve a few years ago. I was driving to my parents' house to celebrate the new year with them. They live a few hours away in upstate Pennsylvania, so I had left in the late afternoon, figuring I'd get there with plenty of time to spare. The drive was supposed to be simple. I'm the type who really enjoys long drives, so a nice peaceful drive would give me some much-needed time to think. But the weather had other plans. The snow started falling about an hour into my drive. At first it was light, just flurries dusting the windshield. Nothing to worry about. I thought the snowfall was actually quite pretty, but I'm pretty sure I jinxed myself. The further I drove, the harder the snow came down. It just kept falling and falling until I was literally in the middle of an honest-to-God blizzard. The highway turned slick and visibility dropped to almost nothing. My car, a little sedan, isn't exactly great in snow, so when the tires started slipping on even the smallest hills, I knew I had to pull over. There was no point in risking my life. It was my own fault for not planning out the drive better. I found a spot on the shoulder far enough off the road to avoid passing cars. Not that there were many. I texted my parents about my situation, and they seemed worried sick. I tried to reassure them that everything would be okay, but I honestly wasn't too sure about that myself. I figured I'd wait out the worst of the storm, hoping it would just ease up. But the snow didn't let up. In fact, it only seemed to get worse from that point. It just kept coming, piling up around the car and on the road ahead. After an hour or so, it became clear I wasn't going anywhere that night. My dad offered to try and get out to me, but I told him that was a death wish. I told him that if the snow didn't let up, I'd call the police, which he begrudgingly accepted as a decent solution. I really didn't want to call the police, and I didn't have AA either, so that wasn't an option. I told myself the storm would have to let up eventually, and I decided that if it didn't by the time I got tired, I'd call the police. The thought of spending the night in the car made me uneasy. I didn't want to run out of gas trying to keep warm, and I was worried about killing the battery if I kept the lights or heat on too long. I sat there, turning the engine on and off every so often, trying to conserve what I could. The wind howled outside. I was starting to feel the weight of the isolation when I looked at my rear view and saw headlights cutting through the storm from behind me. I literally wanted to jump for joy. A snowplow pulled up beside me. I was saved. I rolled down the window as the driver leaned out of his. He was an older guy, maybe in his late 50s. He looked nice. He was wearing a thick jacket and had a black knit hat that was pulled down over his ears. I remember thinking his face was really wrinkly, if that makes sense. It looked weathered, like he had spent decades in harsh conditions. I expected him to say something, but he just stared at me for what seemed like an unusual amount of time. Eventually he spoke, asking me if I was okay. He had a really gruff voice, definitely a smoker, and it was honestly kind of off-putting. I told him that I didn't think my car could handle the conditions, trying to be friendly but also keep my voice steady. He nodded, saying that I wouldn't get far in a storm like this, especially with the car I had. He paused for a few moments, as if he were considering what to say. I watched his eyes scan my back seat, like he was looking for something. I was just about to respond when he offered to give me a ride. I hesitated. I didn't know him, and yeah, he seemed a little strange, but he struck me as a genuine guy. Plus, staying put with my car all night would have been stupid. I asked him if he could drive me to where I was going, and he said it would be no problem. I then asked him what I should do about my car, to which he shrugged his shoulders and said leave it. After a moment, I agreed. I grabbed my bag and climbed into the cab of the plow. At first, the warmth was comforting. I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease as I settled into the seat. He asked me where I was headed, and I told him about my parents' house. I gave him directions, and he nodded again, but didn't say much after that. The silence wasn't awkward, but as the minutes passed, I started to feel more and more uncomfortable. That's when I noticed something odd. He wasn't driving in the direction of my parents' house. I knew because the navigation was literally pointing in the opposite direction. I mean, we were on a local highway. There were only 2 ways to go. I tried my best to sound calm and asked him if we were going the right way in the most normal tone I could muster. I don't think I did a good job though, because I could feel his demeanor slightly change with my question. Without looking at me, he told me we were taking a short detour and that the back roads would be better than the highway. I didn't know the area well enough to argue, but something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. We drove a little longer, and he did in fact get off the highway and start driving along some back road. At least the GPS said we were heading in the right direction, so I thought I was just being paranoid. Something in my gut was still telling me he was off though, so I started looking around the cab more closely. There were red flags everywhere. Empty liquor bottles rolled on the floor near his feet. There were torn up maps stuffed into the side pockets, and I caught a glimpse of a knife wedged between the seats. I felt my heart start pounding. You know that feeling where your heart just starts beating like crazy and you're worried other people can hear it? That's what was happening to me. By that time, I was also positive we weren't going the right way. The GPS kept recalibrating because he missed turn after turn, not even looking at it. I was panicking. As we continued driving, I spotted a house in the distance. It was the only one I'd seen for miles. I had to act. It felt like a lifeline. I waited until we got closer, took a deep breath, grabbed the door handle, and then kicked the door open as hard as I could. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I slammed into the ground and felt my leg flare up with pain. I didn't care though. I got to my feet and started running toward the house. The man shouted something at me, and I glanced back to see him fumbling for something in the glove box, probably going for a gun for all I knew. I didn't look back again. I sprinted through the snow, trying not to slip until I reached the house. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. A man and woman opened it, and they basically pulled me inside. I collapsed onto the floor, trying to catch my breath. I told them what had just happened, and they didn't ask questions. They just called the police. By the time the cops arrived, the snowplow was gone. They said they'd keep an eye out and search the area, but in that storm, finding him was unlikely. They offered to give me a ride to my parents' house, and even help me call someone to tow my car. I was beyond grateful. My dad was furious once he found out, and I haven't driven in the snow since. I always think about what might have happened had I not jumped out of the car when I did. This happened last year. I was shopping at my local Walmart, just doing some typical shopping on a random weeknight. The store was pretty quiet, and it was probably like 8 or 9 p.m. I had been in the store for about 15 minutes or so, and I was in the aisle where they have the fitness items. I was looking at one of those massage guns. I wasn't planning on buying one that day, or even buying one at Walmart, but I had been considering getting one. When I walked by, I noticed it and stopped to read the box. I was in the aisle looking at it for a few minutes, and when I was doing so, I remember hearing some voices in the next aisle over. It happened to be a toy aisle, and this was at sort of the back corner of the store. I heard a man's voice, and then the voice of a child. At first, I paid no attention as I was looking, but soon I heard the man say, "I will buy you this toy if you come with me." I assumed it was the child's father at first, but I didn't really know why he would say that. I couldn't really make out what the kid said back to him, but I heard the man then say something like, "Your mom said it's okay." Then, I just had the crazy thought that maybe this wasn't the child's father. The man started saying, "Come on, let's go," a couple of times. I heard him starting to walk to the end of the aisle. I just had a really bad feeling about it. At the time, I didn't know if I was just being nosy or if I should do something. I decided to walk by the aisle and glance down it to see. I left the aisle that I was in and walked into the next one over, which was a toy aisle, and when I looked down, I saw a man wearing a black jacket and winter hat, holding the hand of a little kid and leading her to the other end of the aisle. Their backs were facing me. I was kind of thinking on the fly, and I said, "Excuse me," to the guy. He turned around and looked really surprised. I picked up some random toy from the shelf. It was some type of stuffed animal. I said I wanted to ask the man a question, if this would be a good gift for my niece. I then started walking over to them. He said he had no idea, and I said I thought he might know. I then asked if that was his daughter. He said no, and he was just watching her for the moment, but then said they really had to get going. Him and the child then walked away. I really wasn't sure if I should believe him or not. Maybe I was making too much of it. I realized it probably was a reasonable explanation, and I turned and started to walk into the opposite direction. I was telling myself that nothing was wrong and I was just paranoid. But I'm not even kidding. About 30 seconds later, I heard a woman's voice calling out a name. For this story, let's just say the name was Sarah. The woman was calling out Sarah, not really loud, but enough for people in the aisles nearby to hear, including me. I walked towards the voice and found the woman a few aisles down and more towards the center of the store. When I reached her, I asked if Sarah was her daughter. She looked concerned and said yes. I had a terrible feeling, and I said that I might have seen her daughter with a man, and I thought they might be leaving. We both started sprinting towards the front of the store. The good thing is that this was probably less than a minute since I had seen the man. When we made it to the front of the store, we saw the man and the child at the self-checkouts area. He was buying one of the toys for her. The girl's mother started shouting, and the man claimed he was just trying to be nice and buy the toy for the girl, but he quickly tried to run away after realizing nobody would believe that. He ran out the door and was able to momentarily get away. I was just happy that the girl was okay and back with her mother. It turned out that the girl had wandered off from her mother to look at toys while her mom was shopping at another area of the store. The mother had believed that her child was nearby, but had actually wandered off much further. I also found out that the guy was located not long after this at all,